Is the West jealous of the Africa-China relationship?
They're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port, harbors.
And what's wrong with that?
And, well, because...
Countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on... I mean, I know, it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really?
We all know the answer. But that jealousy is about to intensify as the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation FOCAC Summit approaches, paving the way for even closer ties. For Africa, this means progress will be even more attainable.
But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom. When it comes to the influence of China outside its borders, I have to say, firstly, it's quite remarkable that they don't seem to have any military ambitions.
But why was the West so quick to respond? Is it jealousy that's driving the West into paranoia? Let's find out. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation FOCAC Summit has begun once again, drawing leaders from 50 African nations to Beijing. Every 3 years, this summit offers a platform for deepening ties between the world's largest developing continent and one of its most powerful economies, China. But this gathering is more than just about trade deals and handshake photo ops. Beneath the surface, the forum signals a shift in global power dynamics and raises some uncomfortable questions for those who have historically held the reins. As African leaders prepare to engage in discussions that will shape the future of their nations, the narrative coming from Western commentators is predictable. Terms like debt-trap diplomacy and neo-colonialism get thrown around with reckless abandon, painting China's involvement in Africa as an insidious plot. But is that the case? Or is it just a convenient narrative spun by the West to undermine a growing partnership they can't control? Is China helping Africa or trapping it in a cycle of dependency?
Secondly, Africa. I'll give you an example, a specific example. Ethiopia. 2004, because it happened to be there, and I have some first-hand experience of it. They went into Ethiopia. I'll tell you why they went into Ethiopia, because they suspected there was oil. Because China is a major industrial power, but it lacks primary resources. Now, instead of going into Africa with troops, colonially, destroying the country, killing people like the West has done for the last 100 years, what they did was they went to Addis Ababa and they said to the government, we would like, we can see you have problems with your infrastructure, we would like to build some new airports, upgrade your railway system, create a telephone system, and rebuild your roads. And we'll do this all for free. No strings attached. We don't want anything from you. And they did. Why did they do it? Because it's soft power.
Western analysts love to raise the alarm about debt-trap diplomacy, insinuating that China's strategy is to lure African nations into taking massive loans that they can never repay, leaving them vulnerable to Chinese control. But is this narrative grounded in reality? First, let's look at the facts. China has been a significant source of infrastructure investment in Africa for decades. In 2023 alone, China approved loans worth $4.61 billion to various African countries, a substantial sum, but hardly a giveaway. These loans, part of larger packages of cooperation, often come with conditions, repayment schedules, interest rates, and project completion deadlines. However, unlike the loans offered by the IMF or World Bank, Chinese loans generally do not come with political strings attached. They don't demand structural adjustment programs that gut social services or require adherence to Western-style democratic principles. The loans themselves are not inherently bad, but the Western narrative paints them as predatory. Why? Because the West, particularly former colonial powers in Europe and the US, fears losing influence in Africa. For decades, they controlled the flow of aid and loans to African nations, dictating terms that often benefited Western corporations more than the African people. Now that China is playing a dominant role in Africa's development, the West feels threatened, and they've responded by branding Chinese involvement as a debt trap. But is this fair? African nations are not blind to the risks of debt. Many leaders, including those at this year's FOCAC summit, are well aware of the potential downsides of heavy borrowing. Countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Zambia are facing serious debt burdens due to Chinese loans. Yet, these same leaders continue to engage with China, seeing development opportunities that Western nations never offered. Why? Because Chinese loans often come with tangible benefits: roads, bridges, ports, and railways that improve connectivity and boost economic activity. Unlike the West's loans, which often force countries to adopt austerity measures, Chinese investments typically focus on infrastructure development, something that African nations desperately need. The West claims these projects are unsustainable, but it's worth noting that when African nations turned to Western lenders in the past, they received little more than empty promises and a pile of debt with no real infrastructure to show for it. This isn't to say there aren't risks. African countries must ensure that they are not taking on more debt than they can handle. But it's equally important to recognize that the debt trap narrative is often exaggerated. China's loans, unlike those from the West, offer a new pathway to development. And for many African nations, that's an option worth exploring. While the debt trap narrative dominates Western media, what often goes overlooked is the real question. What does Africa want from this partnership, and how does it plan to leverage Chinese investment for its gain? The relationship between Africa and China is not one-sided. African leaders are not passive recipients of Chinese generosity. They are active participants in a negotiation process that holds significant weight for their respective countries. So, what do African nations want from China? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. At the heart of this partnership is a desire for development, but the needs of Africa are evolving. In the past, African nations primarily sought infrastructure, roads, railways, airports, anything that could connect their countries and improve trade. And China, with its Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), was more than willing to provide these projects. But as African economies grow, so do their demands. Today, African leaders are looking beyond infrastructure. They want industrialization, job creation, and access to global markets. Manufacturing hubs are a major topic of discussion at this year's summit. African nations are encouraging Chinese firms to invest not just in infrastructure, but in local industries, creating jobs and boosting economic self-sufficiency. This is a significant shift from the past, when African countries were content to export raw materials and import finished goods. Now, they want to move up the value chain. Take South Africa as a prime example. President Cyril Ramaphosa has made it clear that he wants to narrow the trade deficit between his country and China. Like many other African nations, South Africa imports more from China than it exports, creating an imbalance that African leaders are keen to address. Ramaphosa isn't asking for aid, he's asking for a fair trade deal, one that allows African goods to penetrate the Chinese market. This brings us to one of the central issues African leaders are focused on: access to China's consumer base. China has 1.4 billion people, making it one of the largest markets in the world. African countries, particularly those rich in agricultural products, want to sell their goods to China, but they've encountered roadblocks. Beijing's phytosanitary standards, which are regulations concerning food safety and plant health, are notoriously strict. These barriers prevent African exporters from accessing China's lucrative market, keeping them dependent on Western buyers. This year's FOCAC summit presents an opportunity for African leaders to push back on these restrictions. They want China to fulfill its 2021 promise to buy $300 billion worth of African goods. If they can secure better access to China's market, it would be a game changer for African economies, particularly in agriculture and natural resources. But African leaders aren't just looking for access to markets, they're also seeking investment in digital technology and green energy. As the world moves toward a greener future, Africa is positioning itself as a key player in renewable energy, and China, a global leader in green technology, could be a valuable partner in this transition. But why is West so concerned about all this? Whenever China engages with Africa on such a large scale, the West reacts with alarm. To understand this, we need to delve into history and geopolitics. For centuries, Western powers, primarily European nations and later the United States, dominated Africa. They carved the continent into colonies, extracting resources and imposing foreign rule. The legacy of this exploitation still lingers today, with many African countries struggling to break free from the economic shackles imposed by their former colonizers. After decolonization, the West continued to exert influence through financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. These institutions lent money to African nations, but the loans came with harsh conditions: cuts to public services, privatization of state-owned assets, and opening markets to Western corporations. The result? African nations were left saddled with debt, weakened economies, and social unrest. Fast forward to the present day, and the West is watching as China builds a different kind of relationship with Africa. While the West's loans were often accompanied by political interference and economic demands, China's approach is more pragmatic. Chinese investments are focused on infrastructure, development, and trade, not on pushing a specific political agenda. And that's what makes the West nervous. For decades, Western powers controlled Africa's development, using financial institutions to maintain influence. But now, China has stepped in, offering African nations an alternative. The West is losing its grip, and they don't like it. The irony is hard to miss. Western countries, particularly former colonial powers like the UK and France, have been quick to accuse China of neo-colonialism in Africa. But the reality is that China's approach is fundamentally different. Where the West sought to control, China sought to partner. Where the West demanded austerity, China offered infrastructure. Where the West imposed its political will, China respects sovereignty. Of course, this isn't to say that China's involvement is without its flaws. There are concerns about environmental degradation, labor practices, and the long-term sustainability of debt. But compared to the West's historical exploitation, China's role in Africa offers a refreshing change, one that gives African nations more agency in shaping their future. With the West's concerns laid bare, let's take a closer look at how China's strategy in Africa differs from that of the West. The phrase "new scramble for Africa" has been used to describe China's growing presence on the continent, but this comparison is misleading. The original scramble for Africa, driven by European colonial powers in the late 19th century, was an outright land grab. It was about control, exploitation, and domination. China's involvement in Africa, while significant, is built on a very different foundation: partnership. The most prominent example of China's engagement in Africa is the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), a massive infrastructure project that spans continents. Through the BRI, China has invested in railways, highways, ports, and energy projects across Africa. Western critics have labeled this as debt-trap diplomacy, but let's be clear. The West has done far more harm with its lending practices. For decades, the IMF and World Bank lent money to African countries under strict conditions. These conditions often force countries to cut social spending, privatize essential services, and open their markets to foreign companies. The result? Many African nations were left worse off than before, their economies crippled by debt, their social services gutted, and their populations impoverished. China's approach is different. Rather than imposing harsh economic reforms, China offers loans for infrastructure development. These loans, while not without risk, provide tangible benefits: roads, railways, ports, and energy grids that help African nations build their economies. And unlike the West, China doesn't demand political loyalty in return. But it's not just about infrastructure. China is also investing in technology, education, and healthcare. For example, China has built schools, hospitals, and vocational training centers across Africa. These investments, while often overlooked in the West, are critical for Africa's long-term development. Moreover, China's approach is more respectful of African sovereignty. Unlike the West, which often interferes in the domestic politics of African nations, China adopts a policy of non-interference. This means that African leaders are free to govern their countries as they see fit, without fear of external pressure to adopt Western-style democracy or economic policies. Of course, this isn't to say that China's involvement is without its challenges. There are legitimate concerns about environmental degradation, labor practices, and the long-term sustainability of debt. But compared to the West's historical exploitation, China's role in Africa offers a refreshing change, one that gives African nations more agency in shaping their own future. So, what does the future hold for China-Africa relations? For African nations, the primary goal is clear: development. They want to build their economies, create jobs, and reduce poverty. And China, with its experience in rapid industrialization, offers a model for how to achieve these goals. But it's not just about copying China's approach, it's about adapting it to Africa's unique circumstances. One of the biggest challenges facing Africa is its growing debt burden. While Chinese loans have helped to finance critical infrastructure projects, there is a risk that some countries could become over-leveraged. African leaders will need to carefully manage their debt to ensure that they can continue to grow without falling into a cycle of dependency. At the same time, there are huge opportunities for Africa in the areas of technology and green energy. As the world moves toward a greener future, Africa is positioning itself as a key player in renewable energy. And China, with its expertise in green technology, could be a valuable partner in this transition. Another key area of focus for the future will be trade. African leaders are keen to secure better access to China's massive consumer market. If they can do so, it could be a game changer for African economies, particularly in agriculture and natural resources. But perhaps the most important factor in the future of China-Africa relations is the role of African leadership. African nations are no longer content to be passive recipients of foreign aid. They are actively shaping the terms of their engagement with China, negotiating for better trade deals, more investment in local industries, and greater access to global markets. The FOCAC summit marks another turning point in the relationship between China and Africa. It's a relationship that the West has tried, and will continue to try, to undermine. But as Africa pushes forward, seeking more from its partners and taking control of its destiny, the future looks brighter than ever. For too long, the continent was overlooked, exploited, and dismissed. Now, Africa has options, and it's up to its leaders to ensure those options lead to true independence and growth. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit has highlighted the evolving dynamics between two of the world's most critical regions. As Africa and China deepen their ties, the narrative of debt traps and neo-colonialism rings increasingly hollow. African nations are not victims. They are players, actively shaping their futures through partnerships that they control. The West, long accustomed to dictating terms to Africa, is now facing a new reality. China's approach, while not without its challenges, offers African nations more autonomy and development opportunities than they've had in decades. As African leaders engage with China, they are not simply asking for help. They are negotiating, strategizing, and ensuring that this partnership works in their favor. The future of China-Africa relations is bright, but it is not without its complexities. African nations will need to manage their debt carefully, push for fairer trade terms, and ensure that they are getting the most out of their partnerships. But one thing is clear: Africa is no longer content to be a pawn in the games of global superpowers. It is charting its own course, and China is helping to pave the way. Do you think the Africa-China relationship is the future? How will the West handle its growing jealousy? Let us know in the comments section. Do you believe Africa is making the right choice by aligning with China? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.